Thank you very much for having me. I want to thank the organizers. They saw my slides and they gently suggested I take out all the p-values and the 95% constant intervals. So this is a talk without p-values and constant intervals, which is not easy for me. I like p-values. The second thing they told me is that I have to operate without a lectern, and I really like a lectern. It's like the Sean Spicer approach. You know, Sean Spicer, he carries the lectern around. It's Saturday Night Live. So the topic I'm going to talk about is head injury rules in children. And again, this is very much a predict study. I'll have a slide at the end where I thank all the hundreds of people who have, literally hundreds of people who have contributed to the work that I'm presenting. Being from Melbourne, rugby is really not on the radar. So this is, I should have specified, this is an AFL footballer or VFL footballer. From New Zealand. So this is a football, I mean, this is the classic scenario for us. I'm at I work at the Children's Hospital Emergency Department. We have 90,000 kids per year come to the department, and about 3,000 of them have head injuries. Okay, these are huge numbers. So this is a 14-year-old footballer. On a given Sunday afternoon, we have them lined up, stretchers coming out of the department, and you can put a team together. The uniforms and all. Anyway, so the story is that he had a collision with another player. He had brief LOC. The story as to how long LOC is always vague. You never know. You know if it's really long, but beyond that, he vomited twice before he came in. Then he had a GCS of 15. He complains of headache. He had another 2 vomits in the department, and he had a normal neuro exam. So the question is, do you do a CT scan or not? Can I see a show of hands? Who would do a CT scan now? Okay, 3, including David Kreeser. Wow, okay, good. Okay, who would not do a CT scan, just to make sure? Okay, more of you. Okay. How much more do you need? How much more do you need to do a CT scan? Why is there an issue with CT scans? Well, number one, it's cost. If we do a CT scan on all 3,000 kids that come through the door, the director of radiology is going to be in the department knocking down doors. The issue that Natalie mentioned as well, the sedation, a certain percentage of kids need sedation. But the big thing is this. So even though this is, there are newer papers that look at the risk of head injuries and, the risk of CT scans and cancer. This is still, I think, the most impressive graph. So you have age down here, I'm somewhere up here, and kids are, the kids that we see are down here, 0 to 15 years of age, and this is the estimated lifetime attributable risk of death from cancer. This is not just cancer, this is death from cancer, okay? And you have total, and you have brain cancer, and you have leukemia. And as you look at this, under 10, you have this huge increase in the risk of, and even, in a 15-year-old, that is still much, much higher than my risk. So, if somebody scans me, nobody cares. But down here, it's like, okay. So that is the big conundrum in head injuries. You have all made, maybe all of you who've made a decision have made that decision based on the head injury rules that you have incorporated into your frontal lobe. But a lot of us will make that decision based on Gestalt, right? You make a judgment. Yes, we don't think that kids needs a scan. But considering the numbers that you're talking about, there must be more than that. And the more than that are the head injury clinical decision rules. There are more than 20 clinical decision rules out there, and people have spent years laboring over creating them and validating them, etc. But the 3 rules that really stand out are the Chalice rule, the PECON rule, and the CATCH rule. And I'm not going to take you through the details of these because there are elements that are very similar. So this is a Chalice rule. Basically, there are historical factors, examination factors, and mechanism factors that have been identified in 20,000 children that would encourage you to do a CT scan. You can see this whole little long list of factors. And part of this is part of the NICE guidelines in the UK. This is the CATCH guideline, the CATCH clinical decision rule. It's the Canadian rule. And the key thing here is that it has entry criteria. So there's only a small portion of all head injuries that come through the door that actually enter this rule. And the criteria are basically that the patient has to have a mild head injury defined as loss of consciousness, amnesia, witness disorientation, etc. So they have something which really goes beyond mild in my mind. But anyway, and then if they have factors that are based on the things that I mentioned before, they get a CT scan. Now, the PECON rule is a bit different. PECON breaks the rule into less than 2 and greater than 2. They found that when they looked at the kids, or even their premise was that children under 2 are harder to assess in several areas, and therefore they should be treated and they should have different criteria for CT scans. And what they've done is they've worked out a number of factors, and each time you have one of these factors and either can answer them in yes or no, then you move through the whole system until you get to the bottom here. And if all of that is negative, so altered mental status, scalp hematoma, loss of consciousness, mechanism of injury, palpable or unclear skull fracture, acting normally per parent, if all of that is negative, then what they're saying is you don't need to do a CT scan, okay? This is for kids older than 2 years, and the big difference is history of vomiting and severe headache. Why did they take out the history of vomiting? Well, number one, it shook out in the analysis of their 40,000 kids that they looked at. But also, if you work with kids in the emergency department, you walk in the room and they vomit. So it doesn't really help a lot.
That's just you guys.
And then there are also certain historical things that you can ask them, or you can't ask them, do you have a severe headache? He's just screaming at you, or she's screaming at you. So the big difference between these, in addition to the factors that I mentioned, is that Chalice and CATCH, they tell you who to scan, and PECON, who not to scan. So a fundamental difference. So what we did was, we really, within PECON, we felt that we should look at these rules and work out which rule is the best and which one fits best into our setting. So this is the APHIRST study. What was the abbreviation again? Australasian Paediatric Head Injury Rules Study, okay? Anyway, it's like... and we compare PECON, CATCH, and Chalice across these sites from Australia and New Zealand. And see, all the 95% confidence intervals are out, the p-values are out. It's really quite distressing. But this study has just been published in The Lancet, and we looked at 20,000 children at 10 sites. So these are big numbers. And what we found is that for PECON and for PECON less than 2 and greater than 2, the sensitivity was very high. These are the 0.7 sensitivities, 100%, 99%. CATCH 92, Chalice 93. Specificity is a bit higher with CATCH and Chalice. When you look at the actual number of missed patients according to the rules, so we collected all the data that the rules required and the outcomes that the rules required, and then we let the doctors do whatever they wanted, the nurse practitioners do whatever they wanted, and then we checked how many the rules would have missed. And when you look at this, PECON, and they would have missed only 1 patient, and that patient didn't require neurosurgery. CATCH missed 13 and Chalice 12, and 1 to 2 of them in each of these rules would have required neurosurgery. Okay, so we're going to use PECON. Well, so our CT rate was 8%. The reason why the Americans focused on the kids that didn't need a CT scan is because in the US, the worry is their CT rates are so high, their starting point CT rates, they're up to 50% for mild head injuries. Okay? So they needed a safe way of reducing their CT rates. So when we then looked at what would happen to the CT rates, PCARN would increase the CT rate, well, the PCARN projected CT rate would be 8% to 48%. I'll explain it in a sec why. Catch, 30%, so that's again an increase. Chalice would be 22%. Again, that would be an increase. Why does PCARN have this range? Well, there is it's called, the people who are in the know, it's the figure 3, okay? The figure 3 of PCARN. It's later in the text. It's not actually in the results section of the paper in the Lancet. But basically, they've come up with a system of how to digest their results. And they have some factors where CT is recommended. They have some factors where CT is not recommended, the things that I mentioned before, if all of this is negative. And then they have this middle group where either observation or CT is indicated based on physician experience, multiple versus isolated findings, worsening symptoms, and parental preference. So that's why you end up with this big range if you project what PCARN would do to the CT rate. Now, there are a number of studies that have looked at this in terms of what happens if you implement PCARN, okay? And the two studies that I picked out here there's one in Boston where the starting rate was 21% CT rate, and then they reduced it by 6% by just telling everybody about the CT rate and the rule. and then they took clinicians into the shed and said, that's your CT rate, okay? And then the CT rate dropped even more, okay? And it dropped safely. They didn't miss any patients. And this, in Padua, the starting rate was lower, 7.3% in Italy, and the CT rate afterwards, 8.4%. So it's basically the same. And they didn't miss any patients either. So you can implement PCARN. There are a couple questions for us. Yes, we'd like to have a rule, but how good are we without the rules, right? So we looked at this. And again, I'm just missing the p-values and the 95%. So we looked at a cohort of mild head injuries, GCS 13 to 15, and we checked if the doctors at these 10 centers, doctors, nurses, and nurse practitioners, did order a CT scan during the initial visit, right? What we found is when we looked at whether they picked up clinically important traumatic brain injury, so this is a construct that includes kids who died, who had neurosurgery, who were admitted for more than 2 days, who were intubated for more than a day. The sensitivity of the doctors was 98, doctors, nurses, or nurse practitioners, was 98.8%, and picking up traumatic brain injury was 95%, and they picked up all the patients who had neurosurgery. Right? So the clinicians were actually really, really good. And there were only two patients that were missed. And these two patients, so they didn't have an initial CT scan. One was a 13-year-old hit by a small ball. He was admitted for observation for like more than 5 hours. He had vomiting, he had a couple other symptoms, nothing major, was sent home. And came back a week later because he had ongoing vomiting and had a CT scan at the time and had a small epidural bleed in a preform malformation. Is that a real miss? I don't know. Another kid who was kneed during football, AFL football. He had a CT at the representation a week later. So he had this number of symptoms, nothing dramatic. He was observed in the emergency department initially, but didn't get a CT scan, so he was a missed patient. When he came back, he had a small subdural bleed and a sinus fracture. And neither one of these two patients required neurosurgery, okay? So the bottom line is that the clinicians at these 10 participating hospitals, they were actually really, really good. And the question is, do we really need a rule? Are we too good for the rules? So the bottom line here is that we can't just go and implement PCARN because there is a real potential to increase the CT rate. When we started with this, the original plan for PREDICT was that, similar to what Stuart said, we come up with this highly evidence-based guideline. We develop an algorithm which can be incorporated into the local clinical practice guidelines or a national guideline, and this is the rule that you use. These are the factors that you should scan for, and we just simply can't do that. What isn't clear either is as you know, most of children with head injuries are not seen at tertiary hospitals. They are seen at suburban hospitals, elsewhere in the country, and we don't know if there might be more of a role for the rules in non-tertiary hospitals. So there are other questions that play into this. What is the access to neurosurgery that you have if you're based 1,000 kilometers north? What is the rule of transportation? What is the rule of observation? Do you have access to observation? So there are a lot of loose ends. Even though we looked at 20,000 kids, we don't have the answers yet. So what we're doing right now is called the APHIRST GAP study. What was the abbreviation again? Australasian Pediatric Rule Study. That's right. Okay. And GAP stands for gap. And basically what we want to do is we want to assess what the pediatric CT imaging rate is at regional rural hospitals, suburban hospitals, and tertiary hospitals. We're going to look at 3,000 patients. Everybody has agreed to participate in the hospitals. They just still need to do it, but we are hopeful. This is the map where these sites are. As you can see, they're pretty well spread out. And what we'll also do is we will try and figure out the things that I mentioned before. We will interview staff, nurses, doctors, to try and find out what drives CT scanning, because we don't understand yet what the factors are that feed into this in terms of neurosurgery, in terms of distance, in terms of availability of observation, etc. How are we doing time-wise?
You've got 3 minutes.
Oh, good. So the goal ultimately is that we develop a national algorithm for Australia and New Zealand, and we want to take into account special risk groups. In guidelines that are in existence, these patients are often excluded because they're in the too hard basket. But if you work in this environment, you need to take care of these kids regardless and need to make decisions about them. And the special groups are in particular kids with ventricular peritoneal shunt, with bleeding disorders, and child abuse in the wider setting, and non-accidental injuries. And we also really need to, once we understand what goes on in the APHIRST GAP study, we need to address different settings. We'll see how that works out. I'm quite hopeful that we will understand much better what the drivers for head injury imaging will be. So the take-home messages, I think, are that PCARN is really very accurate rule if you're looking for something that will help guide your practice. What we did find is that it's the accuracy of the clinicians in the settings where this study was done in Australia were highly accurate, and that it is not clear how we should apply this rule or any other rule in our setting. And watch this space. We'll hopefully have more answers both for the subgroups that I mentioned, because we'll analyze that, as well as for a national algorithm. Thank you very much.